Hello and welcome to today's webinar on finding enslaved African American ancestors in New England. My name is Ginevra Morse. I'm the Vice President of Education and Programming at American Ancestors. I will be your moderator for today's session. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Our presenter today is 10 Million Names Volunteer Coordinator Danielle Rose. Danielle holds a bachelor's in history from the University of Florida and a master's in public history from Northeastern University. While at Northeastern, she specialized in digital humanities, oral history, and community engagement. As a public historian, Danielle's work focuses on bringing to light the stories of lesser-known individuals and historical events. Prior to joining American Ancestors, she worked as a digital history intern at the National Parks of Boston, where she researched the lives of Black patriots of the Revolutionary War, specifically those who served during the siege of Boston. She also previously worked as a museum educator in Miami, Florida, and her areas of interest include colonial Massachusetts, Revolutionary War veterans, and African American history. Now, slavery in New England played a significant role in the region's early history. Cities like Boston and Newport were important ports for the transatlantic slave trade, with ships bringing enslaved Africans to be sold throughout the colonies. And while slavery had largely disappeared in New England by the early 19th century, the legacy of this institution had a lasting impact on the region's economic and social development. Over the next hour or so, you will learn more about the history of slavery and emancipation in New England, what records exist that detail the names and stories of these enslaved Africans, and strategies to help work through common research hurdles we will also be discussing. At any point during the presentation, feel free to type your question into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. We'll address as many as we can at the end. There is a syllabus for sale at our online bookstore. You'll find a link to that downloadable PDF in your reminder emails as well as in your follow-up email after today's broadcast. We are also recording this event, and starting later today, you can freely go back and review any of the content from this presentation on our website and YouTube channel. So if you missed something on today's first listen, don't worry, you can always review the presentation later. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to Danielle.
Thank you, Ginevra, and welcome everyone to this presentation on researching enslaved African American ancestors in New England. Research on enslaved ancestors often focuses on the South, and that's generally because Southern states had larger populations of enslaved people. However, as we will discuss today, slavery was prevalent in New England and greatly influenced the region's economy and social structures. There's a lot to discuss today, so let's dive right in. We'll begin with our first section, which is the history of slavery in New England. Slavery in New England initially began with the enslavement of indigenous people. A main reason why early colonists enslaved these groups was to remove them from their land and use it for their own purposes. Those that tried to retaliate were captured and enslaved. A major turning point was the Pequot War. It began in 1636 and was a conflict between the Pequot tribe and New England settlers. During the war, hundreds of Pequot men were captured, enslaved, and killed. Some, however, were sold and sent to the Caribbean in exchange for other goods. Enslaved Africans were among the cargo that arrived from the Caribbean at the end of the war in 1638. According to many historians, this marked the first documented arrival of Africans in New England. Shortly after, in 1641, the colony of Massachusetts formally legalized slavery, and they were the first colony to do so. With this came a shift from the enslavement of indigenous people to the enslavement of African people. Some historians argue that one of the reasons why the enslavement of Africans appealed more to New Englanders was because they were technically strangers to the area. Therefore, it was easier to write laws to keep them enslaved. During the 18th century, the slave trade became a major form of commerce for New England colonies. Tens of thousands of enslaved Africans arrived in New England through major ports such as Boston and Newport. In fact, Rhode Island completed more slave voyages than all the other colonies combined. New England's involvement in the slave trade is part of what historians call the triangular slave trade, which is the movement of goods and people between New England, Africa, and the Caribbean. This image shows the relationship between the three regions. Thousands of men, women, and children were captured, brought to the Americas, and forced into slavery. Many went to the Caribbean, where they worked on large sugar plantations to produce molasses and sugar. These products were then exported to New England, where they were produced into rum. And that rum was then exported to Africa and used to purchase and enslave more Africans. So this was an ongoing cycle of the exchange of people and goods. I want to now talk a little more about the direct relationship between New England and the Caribbean. Many New England merchants and wealthy families had ties to the Caribbean. Some of these wealthy families had plantations on Caribbean islands, but as I mentioned before, the more common connection was through trade. Historian Jared Hardesty has described the connection between the two regions as a symbiotic relationship. He argues that many of these Caribbean plantations sustained and flourished because of the New England exports. The New England markets produced goods such as corn, codfish, apples, and timber, and they were produced using enslaved labor. They were then exported to the Caribbean and consumed and used by the enslaved labor on Caribbean plantations, which helped to power these large, lucrative slave societies. So again, we can see how New England and the Caribbean specifically supported each other through the exploitation of their enslaved labor. Another connection was through laws. Caribbean slave society influenced slave laws in New England. For instance, Massachusetts practiced similar customs to those in Barbados to govern slavery. So the two regions had a lot of similarities between them. By 1700, enslaved labor contributed to all parts of the New England economy. There's often a perception only worked on farms. As the New England economy was so varied, we see them working in all types of industries. While they certainly worked on farms, especially in a lot of smaller towns, those that lived in urban areas contributed to other industries, such as shipbuilding and rope making. Many were incredibly skilled and developed a trade. Some worked as blacksmiths, shoemakers. Enslaved people also performed domestic duties within homes, working as housekeepers, cooks, and servants. And as I mentioned before, most wealthy families in New England relied on enslaved labor, either because they were involved in an industry that had a labor force that was comprised of enslaved people, or because they had enslaved people doing domestic work in their households. Next, I'm going to discuss emancipation in New England. New England states slowly emancipated enslaved people at various times. And this is important to note because understanding when a specific state declared emancipation can help you as you start to look at records in specific areas. It can give you a better idea of what records to look at and how to interpret them. In 1707, Vermont became the first state to ban adult slavery through their state constitution. In 1783, Massachusetts and Maine banned slavery through their judicial courts. Maine was part of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts until it became its own state in 1820, so that's why I've placed the two together. So two court cases that were filed by enslaved people went up to the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and the court declared that the institution of slavery was incompatible with the state constitution, which states that all men are born free and equal. In 1784, Rhode Island passed the Gradual Emancipation Act, stating that children born to enslaved people after March 1st, 1784 would be free after they reached a certain age, and that age was 21 for men and 18 for women. However, those born before the state remained enslaved. Connecticut also passed the Gradual Abolition Act in the same year, but their age of freedom was 25 years old. These two acts were intended to slowly phase out slavery. So in Connecticut, for example, slavery technically remained in practice until 1848. And finally, New Hampshire officially abolished slavery in 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution. So now that I've covered some basic history, I'm going to move on to specific records to consult when researching enslaved ancestors. We're going to begin with the records of enslaved people. And in this case, I'm specifically talking about records that name the enslaved individual as the primary person, as opposed to records of an enslaver that mention enslaved people. Enslaved people could participate in certain institutions in New England, such as the church and courts. And these records can provide information about their family members, their enslavers, and depending on the record, you can even get a glimpse of their daily experiences. You'll likely run into some challenges, though, when using these records. First, you'll find that enslaved people are generally mentioned by first name only. This may make it more difficult to determine if you're looking at the correct person, so you'll have to locate other records to help confirm this. Another challenge might be the limited amount of records available. This will require you to get creative and eventually move on to the records of the enslaver. We'll first discuss church records. Enslaved people joined religious institutions for a variety of reasons. For some, their church membership was at the insistence of their enslaver. Others joined willingly, because church often brought a sense of community. In New England, the majority of enslaved people lived one or two to a household, so church provided an opportunity to meet and interact with others. Church was also viewed as a way to legitimize their marriages. Enslaved people did marry, and they were often encouraged to do so by their enslavers, but married couples and families were often separated. Marrying in a church helped formalize their unions and hopefully protect them in some ways. And finally, attending church meant that some received an education. Because New England Protestant churches encouraged all members to read the Bible, enslaved people who joined often learned how to read. Now, church records can provide a variety of information, including dates for major events like births, baptisms, marriages, and deaths. And you can also find the names of other family members or enslavers. A lot of church records are digitized on major repositories like Ancestry, Family Search, and American Ancestors. Here's an example of a database on the American Ancestors website for records for the First Congregational Church in Stonington, Connecticut. And here we have an example of a record that shows the baptisms of 3 enslaved children. Their names are Plato, Dinah, and Catherine, and they are described as 3 Negro children, servants in the family of the late Deacon Thomas Minor. So here you can see we already have the name of the enslaver, and he's referred to as the late deacon, so it seems as though he passed away by the time the children were baptized. But it does look like the children remained enslaved by his family. As you look through different records, you might notice that racial descriptors will vary across these sources. In this example, we saw that the children were described as Negro, but this may not remain consistent with other records you find for them. Racial descriptors were often at the discretion of the person making the record, like a town clerk. So someone who is referred to as Black in one record may be identified as mulatto in another. So while these descriptors may help us identify an enslaved person initially, we need to keep in mind that these ancestors may be described differently as we move forward with our research. Moving on to court records, and just a section does not include probate court records. We're going to discuss those in greater detail in a later section. So enslaved people could file petitions in court. You'll, you'll recall that emancipation in Massachusetts and Maine came about through cases filed by enslaved people. Some examples of court documents that you might find include bills of sale for enslaved people, records of manumissions, which legally freed enslaved people, petitions or suits for freedom, charges for crimes, and other legal disputes. So the US court system has different levels. So you may find records from the town, county, or state or colony, depending on the time period. And also keep in mind that there are separate courts for different types of cases. So civil and criminal cases will be organized separately. Because the court system is very intricate, I'd recommend looking into this book by Diane Rappaport called New England Court Records. It will help you understand in further detail the different types of New England court records and where to find them. Family Search also has a wiki page with resource guides on various topics and locations. So this is the one for United States court records. Towards the bottom of the page, you'll find links to more state-specific resources. So American Ancestors has digitized some court records for certain counties. So here we have a database for Plymouth County court records from 1686 through 1859. And here's an example from that database. We have a transcript of the case Tony and Mariah v. Cornelius Briggs. And you can see that Tony and Mariah are described as Negroes. It looks as though Tony and Mariah filed this case to prove that their daughter Molly was a free person. The defendant, Cornelius Briggs, who is likely their former enslaver, argued that Mariah was not a free woman. The freedom status of enslaved children often depended on the status of their mother. So by arguing that Mariah was still enslaved, Briggs could then argue that Molly was enslaved as well. However, this record shows a jury verdict for the plaintiffs, which means that Tony and Mariah were able to retain the freedom of their daughter. I would highly recommend locating the original record when you research. Transcripts are great in helping with readability and accessibility. However, they can sometimes contain errors or misinterpretations if they're just abstracts. So it's always helpful to compare the transcript to the original record to ensure that you're receiving the most accurate information. So we're going to walk through how to locate an original court record based on the information we have from the transcripts. This is the full page in the book that has Tony and Mariah's court case, and their case is towards the bottom. You'll notice at the top of the page, it says Common Pleas, June 1717. The Court of Common Pleas was the main court in Massachusetts until 1859. It says 1:82 to 85. This represents the volume number and page numbers of the book we're trying to locate. So I have the name of the court, the location, and the volume and page numbers. With all of that, I'm going to go to the Family Search catalog to locate the original record. I generally use the catalog to search by location, but you can see that you can also search by other categories, including titles, author, and keywords. So when you search by location, you can do so on multiple levels. You can do it at the town, county, or state level. But in this case, I'm going to search by county, which is Plymouth County. Now we have a list of the various records available for Plymouth County. You can see here that it includes cemetery records, church directories, court records, among many others. And when we expand the court records section, we can see the various collections that Family Search has. You'll recall that the transcript mentioned the Court of Common Pleas, so we'll select the collection that states that as the author. It'll then take you to another page that provides a brief description of the collection. So near the top, it says that this is a microfilm of original records at the Plymouth County Courthouse. We also have a list of all of the volumes. The transcript had said that the original record was in volume 1, so we'll click on the camera icon to view images of those records. You'll then be able to see scans of the book that holds the handwritten record. So again, the transcript mentions pages 82 through 85. So we'll have to scroll through these different pages to get to the specific pages we're looking for. And once we locate the page, we can view the original record. This one it's pretty legible, so we're able to read at the top where it says Tony and Mariah, again described as Negroes, and they're also identified as the plaintiffs, versus Cornelius Briggs, who's identified as the defendant. And then if you read through, you can see that it describes the case similarly to the transcript, and so we're able to confirm that it's the correct case. All right. So when researching your enslaved ancestors, you will eventually reach a point when you'll have to switch to locating records of the enslavers. We're going to discuss 3 major record sets that I recommend consulting when you get to this stage of your research. The records of the enslaver can help in some unique ways. They can help you determine family groups of the people they enslaved, and you might also be able to trace the movements of an enslaved ancestor, whether that's between multiple enslavers or geographic locations. You'll also run into some challenges. In some cases, you'll find that enslaved people are not named. So for instance, they may only be referred to as male Negro or 25-year-old slave woman. So that will create some difficulty when trying to identify someone. You may also find limited biographical information. You likely won't find dates for vital events for everyone that you're researching. And finally, you might find multiple enslaved people that share the same name. For example, it's possible to come across 2 enslaved people named Sally who were enslaved by the same person. So cases like this definitely make it a little more difficult when trying to differentiate which one is your ancestor. We'll start with probate records, which are often the first record set that I consult when researching an enslaver. Probate records are court documents created after a person's death relating to the distribution of their property and personal estate. Because enslaved people were considered another person's property, you'll often find them mentioned here. Now, locating probate records depends on the state. They're at the town level for Rhode Island and the county level for Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire. But Connecticut and Vermont have what are called probate districts, which sometimes cross county boundaries. So you'll have to determine what the probate districts are before you try to locate the record. You'll also find different types of probate documents within probate files. Wills are very common, though not everybody died with a will. And manumissions will sometimes be included in wills. There are also letters of administration, which determine who handled the estate of someone who died without a will. Petitions are formal requests, and you'll often find them in these files. And an inventory of someone's estate is also usually included in a probate file. Ancestry.com has compiled all wills and probate records into a single searchable database for all New England states. So here we have the database for Massachusetts, but the 5 remaining states also have their own as well. For this example, I'm going to talk about the will of Isaac Royal. The royal family was a prominent, wealthy family in Massachusetts during the colonial era. Isaac owned a plantation in Antigua and amassed a large amount of wealth trading rum, sugar, and enslaved people. In his will, he divides his estate, which included enslaved people, between different family members. So I created a chart to show this division of the estate, and you can see the enslaved people that were bequeathed to specific family members. When we look at the enslaved individuals that were bequeathed to Anne Oliver, Isaac Royal's daughter-in-law, we see Black Betty, and then Betty's children, who were Abba, Quaco, Diana, John, and Nancy. And then we can also see Abba's children, who were Betty, George, Sarah, Jacob, and Jemmy. So with this information from Isaac Royal's will, we're able to immediately determine family groups. We can see 3 generations of a family that was enslaved by the Royals. And if you go down the list of enslaved people, go down to the list of enslaved people that were bequeathed to Penelope, Isaac's daughter, we see another woman named Abba, as well as her 6 children. So this brings me back to one of the challenges that I mentioned earlier about finding enslaved people with the same name. Once you've located enslaved individuals in an enslaver's will, you should then expand your search to the enslaver's family members to locate more information. So in this example with Isaac Royal, my next step in this research process would be to locate the probate files and other records for each person who inherited an enslaved person. You can also find enslaved people listed in an enslaver's inventory or property appraisal. So here we see the names of 9 enslaved men listed. They're Fortune, Baron, Peter, Ned, House Peter, Robin, Quamino, Cuffy Smith, and Philip, as well as 4 enslaved women named Ruth, Trace, Sue, and Jonto. We can also see the monetary value placed on these human beings, which I think really speaks to the dehumanization of slavery. But these are the types of things that you'll see a lot in an enslaver's records. And here is another example of an additional inventory of Isaac Royal's estate. And I wanted to point this one out specifically because it provides the ages of 2 enslaved men. So the first one states 1 Negro man about 70 years of age, and the other says 1 Negro named George about 45 years old. So first, you can see how the information you're provided really varies depending on the record. And second, with this information, we can then determine approximate birth years for the enslaved individual. All right, the next set of records I'll discuss are property records. Now, any transaction involving enslaved people can be recorded as a deed in property records. And again, they're held at different levels depending on the state. So you'll find them at the county level for Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire, and the town level for Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Vermont. There are several types of documents that you can find in property records. You might find bills of sale or records of enslaved people being hired out to another enslaver. Deeds of gift are also included sometimes, so that could include, for example, a record of a father gifting an enslaved individual to one of his children. Any transactions related to probate can also be found in deed books. So if an enslaved person was sold after the death of their enslaver, you might find a record of that here. And finally, manumissions can also be recorded in deed books. So let's go through how to locate property records in deed books. We're going to return to the Family Search catalog and search by location again. This time, we're going to search for records in York County, Maine. And again, we see a list of different categories for York County, and we're going to expand the land and property category to locate the correct collection. In this case, you'll want to search for a collection that says property or deeds with the county as the author. So for our purposes, we're going to look for the one that says York County, Maine Register of Deeds. Now we have a list of the different books that are available to view. You'll first have to browse through the index books to locate all of the records associated with an enslaver. With property records, you'll generally have to search through two different indexes. You'll find one index for the grantee, which is the person buying property, and you'll find another for the grantor, which is the person selling property. So I recommend searching through both the grantee and grantor indexes, and you'll see that both of the indexes are organized alphabetically and by year. Once you've chosen a specific index book, you'll click on the camera icon to browse. You'll then browse through the book to locate the name of the person you're researching. Here we have an example of an index page, and we're specifically looking for records for Samuel Emery. You can see that he's listed as the grantee, but we also have the names of all of the people he's done business with. So if you look over to the right, you'll find information pertaining to all of Samuel Emery's records. This includes the book or volume number, the page numbers, and the dates of the records. So for example, the first record for Samuel says volume 35, page 107, and the date is January 23rd, 1759. So I recommend writing down all of this information for all of the records of the person you're looking into before moving on to locate them. You'll then return to the catalog once you have all of that information, and you'll have to scroll down past the index books to get to the actual deed books. So in this case, I want to locate the record that is in volume 35, page 113. And we can see here that volumes 34 and 35 are categorized together. So we'll click on the camera icon once again to view the microfilmed images. And once we've scrolled to the correct page, we're able to view the actual record. So we can see Samuel Emery's name here, confirming that it's the correct record. And in this transaction, Samuel Emery is purchasing a Negro female child named Violet from Elisha Pleisted. Violet is about 1 year old and is described as a slave born of the body of the Negro slave named Member. So we have the name and approximate age of the enslaved person being sold, as well as her mother's name. We also have the name of her original enslaver, Elisha Pleisted, as well as her new enslaver, Samuel Emery. So you can see that with the deeds and property records, we can start to trace Violet's movement between her enslavers. And here's an example of a manumission in Suffolk County deed books. This record is for an enslaved woman named Phyllis, and she is emancipated by her enslaver, Hannah Davis. It says, in consideration of the good and faithful service of my Negro woman named Phyllis, I have manumitted, discharged, and set free. She also, Hannah Davis also provides Phyllis with a few household items and money to help her as she begins her new life as a newly freed person. Um, I do want to point out, though, that not all enslavers did this. All right, and the last record set that we'll discuss today are family papers of the enslaver. So because enslaved people were often a major part of their enslavers' daily lives, you may find that they're mentioned in some of their enslavers' personal papers. This can include journals or diaries, letters, and account books, among other items. And these these personal papers are often found in collections at local repositories, such as historical societies, colleges and universities, and special collections at local libraries. Keep in mind, though, that these papers may not be digitized, so this research may require a visit to the repository. A great resource to help you determine where family papers may be located is Archive Grid. You can search by location, repository, or even specific people. Let's say that I want to search for the family papers of a man named James Dalton, who was a Boston shipping merchant, and I specify for repositories in Boston. These are the results that would show up. You can see that the Massachusetts Historical Society has a collection of their family papers from 1667 through 1906. Now, keep in mind, Archive Grid does not have the actual papers on their website. It's just a resource that tells you where the records are actually held. So now that I know that the Massachusetts Historical Society has the Dalton family papers, I'm going to want to consult their catalog on their website to determine the best way to view these records. So this is where you'll determine whether something is digitized or if it requires a visit to the archive to view the documents. So luckily, this specific record is digitized, but other records in the Dalton family collection are not. But here we can see a receipt of the transaction between Captain James Dalton and Ezekiel Lewis Jr. So it shows that Dalton exchanged his enslaved person named Prince for Lewis's enslaved person named Pompey. And at the top, we can also see that the transaction occurred in Boston on April 25th, 1750. American Ancestors also has manuscripts and family papers in our library. Some are digitized, and you can access those here at digital.americanancestors.org. Here's the manumission of an enslaved person named Cuff who resided in Lincoln, Massachusetts. So this is an example of one of the documents we have at American Ancestors. So Cuff was enslaved by a man named John Hoare and became emancipated on May 28th, 1776. So you never know what documents you might find in the family paper collections or special collections at a local repository. So definitely take the time to look through their websites and finding aids to determine if they have anything that will be helpful to your research. Okay, so for the final part of this section, I'll just briefly provide a list of additional resources to consider while researching enslaved ancestors in New England. Newspapers often had ads for enslaved individuals that were sold, but also those who managed to run away. So the runaway ads in particular may include the name of the enslaver. Town records, cemetery records, and military records, particularly for Revolutionary War veterans, are other resources to consider. Local histories, published genealogies, scholarly projects, museums, and other historic sites can also highlight important research. An example of a project is the 10 Million Names Project, which American Ancestors launched last summer. The goal of this project is to recover and restore the names of enslaved individuals in what is now the United States from the 1500s to 1865. Our findings will be organized into searchable databases that are free to the public. This is just a shortened list of some of the databases on our website right now. And you'll notice that the 10 Million Names databases have the project's logo to help our patrons easily identify them. This is an ongoing project, so more databases will be added on a rolling basis. Okay, and for the final portion of this presentation, I'm going to discuss a brief case study on a formerly enslaved man by the name of Kojo Hancock. Kojo Hancock was enslaved by Thomas Hancock, the uncle of the famous John Hancock of Massachusetts. One of the earliest documents that names Kojo is Thomas's will, dated March 5th, 1763. In it, Thomas grants Kojo his freedom when he turns 30 years old, under the stipulation that Kojo behaves to the satisfaction of Thomas's executor, which he named as John Hancock. Thomas also left Kojo money for when he gained his freedom, totaling 6 pounds, 13 shillings, and 4 pence. Thomas died the following year, and Kojo continued to live with Lydia Hancock, Thomas's wife. We then see Kojo in a church record for the church in Brattle Square in Boston, Massachusetts. On February 21st, 1768, Kojo was baptized as an adult, and we can see that he is described as the servant to Mrs. Hancock. A few months later, on April 20th, 1768, Kojo, described as the Negro servant to John Hancock Esquire, married Dinah, described as the Negro servant to a Mrs. Alford. This marriage was found in Boston town records, and as you can see, Kojo is mentioned only by his first name in this record and the previous one. In the years following his marriage, Kojo had several children who were all baptized in the same church as him. So Jenny was baptized on January 29th, 1769. Peter was baptized on September 23rd, 1770. And George was baptized on October 3rd, 1773. In all cases, they are described as of Kojo, servant to Mr. Hancock. You'll also notice that Kojo is named as the only parent, but it is possible that Dinah is their mother given their close marriage date. So we know that Kojo later received his freedom as originally promised by Thomas Hancock. And in subsequent records for Kojo as a free man, he is referenced as Kojo Hancock. Not all enslaved people took the surname of their enslaver once they gained freedom, but Kojo certainly did. And one example of Kojo as a free man is this Boston tax list for the year 1800, where he is described as a Black man. He does own a bit of real estate, and it's a little hard to see, but it looks like it was worth about $100. Kojo also appears in the 1810 census record, again listed with the Hancock surname. We see that he resided at Rainsford Lane, and within his household are 16 people of color, including himself. So because early census records only named the heads of the household, it's difficult to determine the identities of all of the people in his household. But we do know from other church records that Kojo Hancock married twice more after his first marriage with Dinah and had at least 4 more children with his third wife. And finally, we have Cato's death record. He died on February 9th, 1817, and next to his name, we see the word colored in parentheses. So this record states that he died suddenly and was buried at South Burying Ground. I could not locate a probate record for Cato himself, so this is the only record referencing his death. Still, these different records allow us to piece together Cato's life from enslavement to his time as a free man. And just to review some key elements from today's presentation, first, determine emancipation in your state to identify relevant record sets before you begin your search. Second, research your enslaved ancestor before moving to the records of the enslaver. Third, expand to the enslaver's family members to help gather more information on the enslaved individuals. And finally, locate the original records if possible. Thank you all for joining me this afternoon, and I look forward to your questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Danielle, for that fantastic presentation. Before we get to your questions, I do want to let everyone know about a few upcoming programs. So starting on February 7th, we have a 3-week online course presented by Melanie McComb on getting started with genetic genealogy, talking about some of the basics of DNA research. Then on February 12th, in partnership with the Slave Legacy History Coalition, the First Church in Cambridge, and the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site, we will be presenting a hybrid program on introducing 10 million names, recover, restore, remember, with some of the members of our Scholars Council for that project. And then on February 24th, we have a full-day seminar on getting started in African American family history research. Danielle will be one of our speakers, as well as others from other experts and members of the 10 Million Names team. So be sure to join us for these upcoming programs. If you'd like to learn more or to register, just go to americanancestors.org/events. All right, so let's get to some questions. So Michael asks about some maybe quantitative statistics or information, how many enslaved persons, for example, are we talking about when we think about those enslaved in New England?
Unfortunately, I don't really have a number off the top of my head. And also, we have to think about the number of people who were enslaved in the Caribbean, but then moved over and were transported to New England. So it's hard for me to really provide a definitive number at this moment.
Let's see. Carol asks, are there manumission records compiled by state?
As in like a published source, like a compilation, or
Yes, I think that's what Carol's asking.
it's possible that some people have done the research to go through like court records and deeds and property records to compile that information. So I would suggest going to the Family Search catalog and go through the drop-down list of the resources that they have available for a specific state to see if there's a published source with that compilation.
And Sandy asks, so if you mentioned wills, and so in a will, are manumissions kind of listed as a manumission for a specific person?
So if it's in a will, it might be just a brief sentence or paragraph within the will. Sometimes wills are numbered with the specific items. So item 1, my daughter receives X, Y, and Z. Item 2, my son receives X, Y, and Z. Item 3 may be my enslaved person will receive manumission upon my death. Sometimes it's really just a quick, short sentence or mention.
Jenny asks, is there a way to research where and when an enslaved person may have been purchased?
I would recommend going back to the enslavers' family papers or personal papers. They might have a receipt of that. Sometimes you might also find account books at a historical society or a local library that may detail that information. And again, you might find that information in newspaper ads.
Um, Patrick asks if you can say a bit more about some of the non-civil records, such as church records, and how they might be useful for your research.
So you mean like just expand on
Yeah, for this area in particular, this topic, how can church records and other kind of non-civil records be useful?
yeah, so church records specifically, you it doesn't they don't just include um dates of baptisms and things like that. Sometimes you might find small descriptions of a person. You also find minutes of meetings. Any church business might be included in church records. So, I know I just gave an example of like a baptism record, but any dealings with the church will be in church records. And because in early New England, the church was involved in a lot of different areas, they provide a lot more information.
Carol asks, when did the US Census start including the number of enslaved people in a household?
The very first census in 1790 included the number of enslaved people. So early census records had about 4 or 5 columns, and there's one specific column that says slave. Um, and then as you continue through the different decades, you might get, they'll probably be broken down more. So enslaved people based on age ranges, so like 5 to 10, 10 to 15 years old. But yeah, the very first census does have those numbers.
Dolores asks, how unusual is it to have an enslaved person named in a family Bible?
I don't think it's unusual. Um, it will often depend on the enslaver, but I do believe you might find one here or there.
Jill asks, does the 10 Million Names Project encompass the entire country?
Yes. We are including any territory that is now the United States. So we definitely have some ongoing projects in the Midwest, the South. We're not just focused on New England.
And another question, if an enslaved person was mentioned in the probate inventory but not in the distribution, is there some meaning to that? Is there something to kind of be inferred from that omission?
Um, it's likely that the enslaver just did not specify who would inherit that enslaved person. But what you'll often want to do is look at other files within other documents within the probate. Um, Sometimes you will see what property is sold off to other people. So you shouldn't look too much into that if it doesn't specify who that person will go to, because there is a way to find out where that enslaved person might end up.
Ellen asks, are the enslaved persons indexed in the American Ancestors collection for the enslavers documents that you showed?
So the enslaved persons are not, it depends on the collection. Um, they're not necessarily indexed separately. But again, it depends on the collection for our American ancestors databases.
Jill asks, how can we who are researching enslaved persons participate in the 10 Million Names Project?
You can participate in a variety of ways. Um, First, we are always looking for contributions from the public. We know that a lot of people, a lot of independent researchers have done this work for many years before our project's inception. So on our website, we do have a form where you can submit any documents that you found um, that name enslaved people. And you can also volunteer. We have a couple volunteer projects going on at the moment. I am the volunteer coordinator, so um, I can get you started on a project that fits your interests. But you can email me at 10mn@nehgs.org. So that's 10mn at nehgs.org, and we can see what best fits your interests.
Carol asks, is the 10 Million Names Project collecting materials and letters of people that lived in New England after 1865?
Yes, we are. We've had some people submit documents after 1865. Um, Again, we'd love to find records that name enslaved people. So let's say it's a newspaper article of someone mentioning their enslaved ancestor. That's a great resource. So you can always submit, and we'll see how it best fits into the project.
Let's see. Yvette asks, any tips to research enslaved people that may have been sold to the Caribbean from New England?
So I would say you'd probably first have to identify the enslaver, if it's possible, and then track down those documents within the Caribbean. So the enslavers' documents within the Caribbean. And again, Family Search has really great the Family Search Wiki has really great resources and guides, not just for the United States. So if you're able to determine what country in the Caribbean they're in, then you'll be able to kind of identify what resources to look into.
Let's see. Carol asks, is there a list of ships that brought slaves to New England?
Yes, there is a website, I believe it's called slavevoyages.org. Um, and it has I believe almost every ship that did slave voyages. So that'd be a great resource to look into.
And Jenny asks, is there a place I can find more information or instructions on adding a person to the 10 Million Names Project?
Yep. So if you go to 10millionnames.org, you'll be able to find that online form. It's on our homepage, and it's pretty user friendly, so you should be able to upload very easily.
All right. Well, thank you again so much, Danielle. Thank you everyone for your great questions. I know we weren't able to answer everyone's question, but if other questions arise or if you'd like to reach out to us, and certainly learn more about the 10 Million Names Project, you can again go to 10millionnames.org. You might consider hiring our research services team to do research on your behalf, but you can also use our Ask a Genealogist service. It's a free service that's open to the public. It puts you in touch with genealogists on our team, and it's available Monday through Saturday, 9 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Just go to americanancestors.org/chat. So if you have questions about this topic or other family history topics, reference questions, maybe trying to read hard to read handwriting, those are all great questions for our genealogists through the Ask a Genealogist service. So thank you again for joining us. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback on today's webinar. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any feedback is very helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to help keep these programs free and to create more. And if you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org. Thank you again, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.